I've mentioned already that Nano Server is really a subset of what we see there in Server Core itself. And as a subset, as a near headless operating system, you can imagine that the usage scenarios for Nano Server are going to be quite a bit fewer than what you would get with Server Core. And so let's spend some time here before we get into clicking around there in Nano Server, even getting it deployed. Let's talk a bit about when and where you may actually deploy Nano Server. So you have a feel for when the near-term use cases may be, as well as those that are perhaps just a bit further out in terms of your embrace for this new version of the operating system. Here for Nano Server, we have, at least at the time of this filming, a rather small list of the usage scenarios, the possible usage scenarios for when you might need Nano Server. The first of which is the use there as a DNS server. And the gotcha here being that your Nano server, when it's converted to use as a DNS server, is not going to have any kind of attachment there to Active Directory in your domain. In the Windows world, most of our DNS servers these days are Active Directory attached and work with storing their content there in Active Directory. This edition of the DNS server there on Nano Server has none of that integration there with Active Directory. So a DNS server here is really an old school or more Linux-like DNS server where all the content there exists in a series of files as opposed to the Active Directory database. You can also use Nano Server as an IIS server with a series of gotchas about what actually there exists in the world of Nano Server itself. If you have a website that does not have requirements that conflict with what is actually available here in IIS, you could potentially use Nano Server to create a very thin web server for the support of whatever website you may require. Now, in addition to these two, we have three more use cases here that are a bit more specialized or fine-tuned for the Nano Server environment. The first of which is the use of Nano Server as a scale-out file server. In your environment, you probably have a NAS head, which is just some piece of code that sits on top of just a bunch of disks. Those disks, in combination with the hardware, then create all the necessary RAID combinations and the necessary other bits to enable access to the content on those hard drives. But the actual NAS head itself usually is a pretty thin version of whatever operating system you're working with. The use of Nano Server here as a scale-out file server presents kind of the same sort of configuration in that the operating system, the NAS head as it were, is just a very thin version of Microsoft Windows and Windows Server like what you see here. And so if you are planning on deploying out a scale-out file server and you're ready to deploy it in a very thin sense, the usage here of Nano Server for that SOFS or its cluster can be really useful in presenting a very limited attack space and management space there for serving up your files and folders. In the same way, too, Nano Server can be used as a Hyper-V host and Hyper-V cluster. If you played around with VMware's product vSphere, you're aware that the ESXi hypervisor is itself a very trimmed down version of another OS. Well, Microsoft here presents Nano Server as an option for setting up a Hyper-V host with, again, a very thin operating system that doesn't get in the way of the execution of your virtual machines. That same operating system tends to have fewer security vulnerabilities because there's just less code there. And so when you're building a Hyper-V environment, whether it be individual hosts or clusters, the use of Nano Server here can assist greatly with reducing that attack surface, reducing the management surface, and just creating almost like an appliance in the same way that ESXi provides that for VMware for the use and running of those virtual machines. The last of these usage scenarios here is very similar to our Hyper-V hosts and clusters, but focuses its attentions there on the container type execution model, like what you're seeing more of here in this release of the operating system. Microsoft is embracing the use of containers quite a bit with this version, and although for many of us, until we go about developing on top of containers, the use of containers is something we're probably just merely going to be exploring, at least until we get a little bit further there in the future. The use of Nano Server as a container host is definitely an option for you as you go about figuring out exactly how to work the use of containers there into your everyday practices. Now, in addition to these five, there is really a sixth option here that has more to do with the developers of our world. This is the use case when developers are specifically encoding what we think of as microservices. This whole move to microservices is a very recent shift in how developers are coding their applications, and it links together with what we were talking about before with our container hosts. You and your applications that you're working with right now today, maybe third-party applications, are probably not going to be able to take advantage just yet with this whole notion of microservices. It is relatively new in the industry, outside of anything but homegrown applications, but is getting quite a bit of uptake there in the world of developers. Then making this whole notion of microservices and the containers that they often reside on something that we IT professionals should really kind of keep our eyes on as we think about future-proofing our skills for how things may change in the future. So these usage scenarios here, I mentioned there are 5, there are actually 6 here, that at least at the time of this filming are some of the major ways in which you might see yourself implementing Nano Server, either now or into the indeterminate future.